Bom, muito bom dia a todos e a todas. Bem-vindos ao segundo dia das 12ª Conferências Anual do IGOT da Universidade de Lisboa, neste ano intitulado Pessoas, Território e Mobilidades. Antes de mais, um pedido de desculpas por este pequeno atraso, mas o de hoje, com um pouco de chuva, tornou-se um pouco mais complicado para que alguns de nós chegassem à universidade e concretamente ao IGOT. Ontem, nestas conferências, tivemos um dia, uma manhã dedicada aos olhares sobre o turismo. Hoje vamos ter uma manhã muito preenchida com os olhares sobre as migrações. Deixem-me fazer uma saudação especial em nome do Centro de Estudos Geográficos aos nossos convidados especiais. Desde ontem, doutores honoris causa da Universidade de Lisboa, o professor Russell King aqui ao lado e o professor Alan Williams. É uma honra muito grande para nós tê-los como doutores da Universidade de Lisboa. Eu estou aqui a representar o Centro de Estudos Geográficos, e o Centro de Estudos Geográficos, sendo a unidade de investigação e desenvolvimento do IGOT, sempre se associou a esta conferência desde a sua primeira edição. Esta conferência, ela própria, contribui para a consecução dos objetivos, pelo menos de alguns dos objetivos estratégicos do Centro de Estudos Geográficos, através, nomeadamente, do desenvolvimento da investigação de alta qualidade, centrada nas temáticas das dinâmicas sociais e territoriais, pela elevação também do perfil de internacionalização da investigação, que é um tópico que é muito caro ao Centro de Estudos Geográficos, o aumento do impacto societal da investigação, contribuindo para as políticas públicas, para o desenvolvimento sustentável e inclusivo das cidades e das regiões, para a implementação de uma política de ciência aberta, sólida, com o objetivo da promoção, da cooperação, da transparência na solução de problemas geográficos, e ainda para a dinamização da disseminação e comunicação de ciência, da ciência na sociedade, contribuindo para a melhor visibilidade do Centro de Estudos Geográficos e do IGOT e o reconhecimento social do conhecimento geográfico. Como conhecem e sabem, o Centro de Estudos Geográficos organiza-se em 6 grupos de investigação. Nesta conferência, 2 desses grupos estão envolvidos muito ativamente e nós saudamos e valorizamos muito isso. O grupo Território, Turismo, Património e Território, que ontem teve o seu dia de palco, e hoje o grupo MIGRARE, Migrações, Espaço e Sociedade, que nos irá também mostrar muito do trabalho que tem sido feito neste âmbito no Centro de Estudos Geográficos. O dia vai ser, ou amanhã, vai ser bastante preenchida. Nós vamos ter de início uma keynote speaker do Russell King. Minha colega aqui ao lado, a professora Lucinda Fonseca, já fará as apresentações, e depois teremos um coffee break. Vamos tentar manejá-lo de forma a recuperarmos um pouco do tempo que perdemos agora de início, com primeiro um painel sobre migrações, investigação e geografia, onde os membros, o conjunto de membros do grupo de investigação MIGRARE nos vai falar do assunto, e depois, no final, uma mesa redonda também sobre migrações, os desafios da pós-pandemia. Portanto, o programa é recheado e é bastante interessante no ponto de vista de um geógrafo físico, que está a falar daqui, e a geografia é cada vez mais global, ou seja, a separação entre geografia física e geografia humana é cada vez menos interessante. É cada vez mais interessante pensarmos em perspectivas globais, porque os temas se articulam todos no final uns com os outros. Portanto, muito bom, muito obrigado por terem vindo, a quem está presencialmente e a quem nos está a acompanhar na edição online, e uma excelente manhã de ciência para todos. Muito obrigado.
Muito bom dia a todas e a todos. Vou falar em inglês. Hoje, amanhã, vai ser toda em inglês, mas penso que toda a gente que está na sala consegue compreender. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the IGOT Annual Conference. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Russell King, our keynote speaker today. For those of you that didn't have the chance to participate in the ceremony of the honorary doctorate yesterday, I will introduce him again, even though it's not needed because he is well known of most of you. Russell King is a professor of geography and migration studies at the University of Sussex and one of the most recognized scholars in this research field. He has held visiting appointments at the University of Malta, Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel, the University of Trieste in Italy, and Cornell in the USA. He was Willy Brandt Guest Professor in Migration Studies at Malmö University, and he is a member of the External Advisory Committee of the PhD program in Migration Studies of the University of Lisbon. We are really very, very fortunate to have Russell on board, as well as Professor Joaquim Arango here and our good friend Carlos Teixeira in British Columbia in Canada. Russell King has supervised more than 60 PhD students and is recipient of many research grants from a variety of sources. He has written extensively on different forms of migration, including labor migration, return migration, retirement migration, student migration in many countries around the world. At Sussex, he was Dean of the School of European Studies, head of the Geography Department, and director of the Sussex Centre for Migration Research, one of the largest and most prestigious groupings of migration scholars worldwide. It's so famous, that's why he attracts PhD students from everywhere. From 2000 and 2013, he was editor of the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. He has received several awards, including the honorary doctorate by the University of Lisbon yesterday. Today, he is going to talk to us about three elements: geography, migration, and Portugal. Thank you, Russell. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Lucinda, for that lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, both for the wonderful ceremony yesterday and to have the chance to open the second day of this conference. So here comes my, oh, okay, it's gone. Okay, here comes my, my title presentation, and you can see it's organized around three keywords, and sorry, it's frozen. Okay, I should use this. Okay, no, it's okay. It's only the first. It's just the first one. Okay, right. I'm learning. So yeah, my talk has a kind of triangular structure. So this is an example, if you like, of triadic thought in which things are considered in threes. And the relationships between them are also considered in a more sort of complex trilateral way. And my talk is going to be divided under these three headings. So I'm going to say something about geography, something about migration, and something about Portugal, and how they're all sort of folded together in what is, in a sense, a kind of personal academic identity. So my first question, in a sense, it's a question to all of you, and it is, do you have an academic identity? And if we had more time, and this was more like a sort of student engagement, I would ask you to turn to the person next to you and discuss what are the bases of your particular kind of academic identity as a student or a researcher or a scholar. But in order to save time, I'm not going to ask you to do that. I'm going to sort of try to persuade you that for a geographer, or in a sense, any empirically driven social scientist, your academic identity is defined by three things, and hence the triangular structure. The discipline that you study, your parent discipline, which for me and most of us here, I guess, is geography, but it could be sociology, anthropology, political science, or whatever. The particular research theme or topic that you focus on within that discipline, which for me and for many of us here today, I think would be migration studies, but again, it could be something else like social class or climate change or post-colonialism or a topic like that. And then the third element of the triangle is the place or the space where you do your field work and where you collect your data, assuming that you are a field scientist and collects data by going and doing field work. And for me, for the purposes of this lecture today, I'm going to focus on Portugal, but I could equally substitute, Italy or one of the other countries that I've done field work in. And this academic itinerary, if I can call it that, can change. Of course, it's not fixed for all time. It's fairly rare to change disciplines, although it's not unknown. And geographers in particular are quite open to moving around the kind of disciplinary landscape by moving into sociology or maybe anthropology. Whereas, oh, it's moved on. Sorry, I didn't touch it. Can we move back?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. This thing has a mind of its own, it seems. So it's rare for the discipline to change, but of course the research topic and the place that you do research can change. You can move from migration to something else or from something else into migration. For the first 10 years of my research career, I focused on land reform. I was obsessed with land reform for about 10 years during and after my PhD. And then I saw the light and switched to migration studies. And likewise, the place that you carry out research can change. On the whole, anthropologists, for example, would tend to stick to the same place or the same country or the same culture and build their lifetime's career around that. Geographers, I think, are more eclectic, let's say, and move around more. And of course, this opens up the benefit of comparative studies by having experience of doing research in different contexts. So I want to say a few words about geography, which I think is the best subject in the world. I'm speaking to some extent to a converted audience, but I can see I can see Professor Arango sitting there, who of course is a noted sociologist, and he's probably already disagreeing with me. But I think geography commends itself as an academic subject. I mean, particularly to study migration, and I'll come on to that in a minute, for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, its innate breadth and flexibility. It's one of almost the only academic discipline that spans both the human and physical world. It's also a very open discipline to interdisciplinary study, both with other disciplines like sociology or anthropology or political science or history, and also to interdisciplinary fields like migration studies or environmental studies or development studies. And thirdly, it enables one to combine being a geographer with a particular, I think, personal identity and maybe even lifestyle. So, concern for the environment, for example, green activism, a love of the countryside and of certain activities like traveling or hiking or whatever. So I think for these three reasons, and maybe there are many more, geography commends itself as an academic discipline. And for me, I've always wanted to be a geographer since, I don't know, the age of about 10 or 11 or 12. I've always known that that's going to be my subject. And therefore, that opens up a kind of little window, a rather dark and murky window into my early past, which I want to kind of share with you in the next few slides. This is some of the reasons of my sort of personal journey into geography. I should say that I've never talked about this in a public forum before, so I feel quite self-conscious in kind of sharing these experiences with you. But I hope that it might sort of resonate with some of you just by taking my personal example of how I became sort of seduced into the subject of geography. And there are these 5 reasons. And here I'm really winding back my sort of lifeline to the age of 10 or 11 when I went to secondary school and I first became interested in geography. And this was because I had a great geography teacher. I went to a sort of traditional boys sort of academic school where most of the teachers that I remember were kind of arrogant, supercilious. 1 or 2 of them were probably bordering on the sadistic, the way in which they like to physically hit small prepubescent boys. But this guy, Mr. BW, also known as Bernie Grace, was for me my first kind of introduction to academic geography. And he was just such a great teacher. He had a sense of humor, which practically none of the other teachers had. He was able to make fun of himself, which none of the other teachers would do. And so for me, he was a real inspiration. And this is a picture from him from the school archives of the 1950s. Basically, we're talking about the late 1950s. And here are these other activities which I was involved in. They probably portray a picture of a rather solitary, maybe sad boy who was interested in stamp collecting, cycling, maps, and sketching and drawing. But I mean, I was who I was at that stage. It's like that phrase. One of the phrases which has come to really annoy me in recent years is the phrase, "It is what it is." You know, you have an argument with somebody and they say, "It is what it is," which, you know, essentially means no further discussion. You know, we can't change anything. It is what it is. And that really annoys me. But this is looking back, and I was who I was at that time, and so be it. So I was obsessed with stamp collecting as one of the things. The backstory there is that my father worked as a bank messenger. So his job in the late 50s and actually throughout the rest of his career was to walk around London taking messages from one bank to the other. And as part of this, he was responsible also for opening the mail in the mail room that came in. He worked for a bank called the Bank of Nova Scotia. And so lots of Canadian stamps, lots of stamps from what was then the British Empire or the British colonies. And he would bring these stamps home and I would develop this interest in, and I built up a huge stamp collection from the age probably of about 8 or 9 onwards. This keeps changing. Okay, and one of his friends, one of our neighbors, worked for the Anglo-Portuguese Bank. So I also had a supply of Portuguese and Portuguese colonial stamps as well. Then I was also very interested in cycling as a way of escaping into the countryside and escaping sometimes a difficult home situation. Don't want to go into that in any more detail, but it was a great way of getting out at weekends and as often as possible to cycle initially around the local area and then more widely within the UK and indeed in my later teens across Europe. And maps, of course, as the quintessential tool of the geographer and the tool of the cyclist were also important. They are the tools of the trade of being a cyclist, a traveler, a hiker, a geographer. But maps are also artistic products as well. They have a certain aesthetic quality, which I think I came to appreciate. A beautiful map is a work of art. And this leads to the final element in this kind of personal collection of entry points into geography, which is an interest in sketching and drawing. I always did art as an extra subject at school. And it was also the case that as your training as a geographer, at least up until probably the 1960s, involved training in field sketching. It's something that is no longer part of the recognized tools of trade of being a geographer, but I had this ability and interest to sketch landscapes and house styles and so on. And I was also interested in birds at that stage. I was an inveterate bird watcher, so I was also sketching birds. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm going to run through some of these some of these examples now. So I'm going to open up my stamp collection to you and just show you how, in a way, stamps can tell a geographical story. You look at a set of stamps like this. This is just one of 1,000 pages in my stamp collection, and you can see British Guiana, the whole kind of story of this particular British colony, the map on this, the map on the stamp in the middle, and then the various activities that are going on, and you get a window, you get a geographical window into the life and geography of this particular country, in this case, a British colony. In more detail, you can see the actual activities that are going on. So we have cocoa farming, we have picking oranges, we have a mountain of bananas, we have artisan crafts, basket weaving, and so on. And so at that time, when I was interested in collecting stamps, these were a kind of window on an exotic world, which, from the basis of 1950s, early 1960s Britain, which was still quite an austere place with limited travel opportunities, this was really a kind of eye-opener to different worlds, different climates, different landscapes. Of course, nowadays you view these slides with a very different eye. I mean, nowadays I would view this slide, these pictures, and I would see, colonial exploitation, stripping out of material resources, mining, plantation agriculture, the colonial economy, and a very different kind of interpretive lens can be cast on these stamps. And also the stamps provide, in a similar kind of line of argument, these stamps provide a very exoticizing, colonialized view of the colonies, the British colonies. The primitive nature of fishing or making fire. If we look at the second slide down, second stamp in the middle, then there's somebody making fire. The usual map, which of course is important to locate the colony, but the semi-naked native colonial body comes across in these slides in a way which in those days was just an exoticizing kind of image, but nowadays we see it in a very different light. We see it through a kind of exaltation or primitivization of the colonialized and colonized population. And then I mentioned Portuguese colonies, so just to sort of make a little connection with Portugal, which of course is part of my story in this talk. I was also collecting stamps from Angola, from Mozambique. Angola and Mozambique seem to be very obsessed with wildlife. There were a wonderful series of fishes, butterflies, animals, birds, and so on, which here are just two examples. And then I finish off with a set of stamps from Cape Verde. And I remember being kind of, a bit kind of obsessed with the sort of the haircuts and the funny hats of these Portuguese explorers. I mean, it sort of opened up a world of difference for a 10, 11, 12-year-old child was a kind of eye-opener onto a mysterious world. Okay, so sorry, I'm missing some slides are jumping over, so I have to sort of go with the flow a little bit here. The next thing is cycling. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal passion, lifelong passion for cycling. This is the bike that I've had longest in my little collection. It's a bike which I have had for something like 60 years since being a teenager. I bought it secondhand. I still keep it for nostalgic reasons, and it's kind of one of my favorite bikes. The point I'm trying to make here is that the bike, and here is another beautiful old bike which I built up myself, is really, a wonderful, simple tool of engineering. It's a wonderful mode of transport, costs very little, a solution to the climate crisis, and it's, I think, something that should be much more widely used. I'm a bit saddened to see not more people cycling in Lisbon, actually. I mean, I know that there are efforts to try to get cycling going, but from just my superficial observation of the city, there's a long way to go yet, even though I know that Portugal is the biggest European manufacturer of bicycles and bicycle components. So you have this specialism, but it doesn't yet translate into the widespread use of the bike. Better still, get yourself a tandem and take along your partner or friend is my final message. This is our tandem. Okay, maps are another element of, I think, the geographer's sort of interest. These are the earliest maps that I could find that I used as a developing cyclist in my early teenage years in the 1950s around Southeast London, which is where I was born and grew up. So maps of Southeast London, Kent and Sussex. And then the final element in this sort of personal sort of journey into my early past is my fascination with sketching. These are sketches which I did as a teenager of thatched houses. This is a rather better one, of which I'm slightly more proud. And it's a pen and ink technique in which, you know, the challenge is to represent textures like trees, water, stonework, grass, in a way that hopefully, you know, sort of impressionistically resonates with the reality that you're trying to portray. And then finally, my obsession with bird watching, which again was an early interest, enabled me to sort of sketch birds from pictures and zoos and so on. These are actually sketches from 1958 when I was around 12 or 13. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's come back to the fascination of migration studies, which is the second element in my triangle. And the first point I want to make here is a pretty obvious point, I think, for us as geographers, that as a human process which is inscribed simultaneously in space and time, migration is an intrinsically geographical topic, and therefore geographers are extremely well placed to study migration. Not only is it essentially a time-space event, it's also a significant event in the biography of the people who migrate. It therefore has a significant impact on their lives in many cases, although there is a danger of pushing that too far. There's an interesting strand in the literature on migration in recent years about the demigrantization of migration studies. Janine Dahinden from one of the Swiss universities has published a really important paper saying basically that we shouldn't be too obsessed with the role of migration in migrants' lives. We shouldn't fetishize migration. We need to set the migration event within a broader biographical and also social context. So that point, I think, has to be slightly calibrated by this alternative view. Especially in the UK, but I mean, in many countries around the world, migration is very highly politicized. It was extremely politicized and instrumentalized in the Brexit debate, and you know, the amount of disinformation and exaggeration and politicization around migration was one of the key factors why the Brexit vote went the way it did against many people's expectations. And geographers are, I think, especially good at recognizing and categorizing the many types of migration, the fact that it's a very varied phenomenon, short versus long distance, internal versus international, forced versus voluntary, economic versus lifestyle migration, and so on. And finally, in this list, geographers have great skills combinations, from the population geographer skills in mapping and modeling migration to the social and cultural geographers' insights into the life worlds and cultures of migrants. So from what I've just said, hopefully we can recognize the close association between geography, particularly human geography, and migration studies. In other words, and this is a slightly invented term here, we can recognize the inherent geographicity of migration. And I think that the spatial turn in the whole of the social sciences since probably around the 1990s, I mean, driven especially by the work of prominent geographers like David Harvey and Doreen Massey, has meant that also through migration, we have appreciated the role of the spatial and the geographical in migration studies, and indeed in interdisciplinary research across a whole range of activities. I mean, tourism studies, my colleague Alan Williams' speciality, would also apply here as well. And from this position that geography has, what I see as a kind of central and strategic position within the intellectual landscape of different disciplines, geographers have made really important contributions to the development of theory in migration as well. And the bottom part of this slide just tries to kind of name check some of the key figures in migration, mobility, transnationalism, and diaspora, which I see as the four kind of keywords of contemporary migration studies. We've moved from migration, which I think still is absolutely valid as the kind of core key term, of course, of migration studies. That's almost a tautology. But we've also had the mobilities turn, the transnational paradigm, and diaspora has come back into fashion as a key concept as well. And a number of geographers have made fundamental contributions almost down through the centuries, if we go back to Ravenstein. But also we think of the contribution of Hagerstrand, Mabagunji, Zielinski, Catherine Mitchell, and many, many others to the development of theory in migration. And when we think about theorizing migration, it seems to me that there are about half a dozen key questions that we need to consider. This is developing the typology that White and Woods did back in their book in 1980 called The Geographical Impact of Migration. And these key questions, I think, apply to all kinds of migration studies down through the decades. Why does migration take place? That's the key theoretical question of explanation. Who migrates and therefore who does not? What are the shapes and patterns of migration flows? In other words, what is the geography of migration flows, and how do these geographical patterns change over time? And then three questions about the effects of migration. What are the effects of migration on the place of origin, the place of destination, and indeed on the migrants themselves? And then the final question, which I've kind of added to this list of White and Woods, and which is obviously more current, what is the relationship between migration and globalization? How has migration shaped the world, and how have the changing forces of globalization themselves reshaped migration? And so we have both old and new migrations. We have three types, perhaps, of what we can call old, well-established migrations: the settler migrations, which took particularly European migrants to Latin America, the United States, Australia, South Africa, and so on. Many of those migrations were bound up with histories of colonialism and exploitation. We have the post-war guest worker migrations that dominated the 1950s, 60s and 70s to Western Europe, the Gulf states, and so on. We have refugee migrations and different kinds of forced migration, which of course also have historical resonances in the migrations of slavery and indenture. And these kind of canonical types of migration tend to lead to the assumption that all migrants are somehow poor and poorly educated, and labor migrants, and economically driven or forced to leave for political reasons or whatever. But nowadays we have new types of migration, also new geographies of migration, new motivations linked to the retreat from labor migration. So we have lifestyle migration, we have student migration. We have new space-time patterns and fluidities of migration as a result of this process of time-space compression. So we have circular migration, business travel, onward migration, serial migration, and so on. So migration is a much more mobile phenomenon. We have the forces of globalization and neoliberalism, which increasingly dictate the parameters of migration and remind us of the continued dominance of capital over labor, including migrant labor, which continues to be functionalized down through history and continue today as essentially a kind of reserve army of labor, to use a classic Marxist phrase. And then we also have the way in which migration develops in response to so-called crises. I'm a bit critical of the label of crisis, and I prefer to use words like turbulence or unsettling events. But we've seen a whole series of them, from the 2008 global financial crisis, the geographical rupture of Brexit, the immobilities, the new immobilities caused by the COVID pandemic, the possible longer-term effects as yet not really seen in full, although the signs are clearly evident already of the impact of climate change. But as I said just now, I'm wary of what I call the crisisification of migration. Migration is not to be regarded as a crisis. This term, the migration crisis, is, I think, a falsely applied term. I mean, migration may result from other types of crisis, perhaps, but the term crisis is too easily manipulated into kind of persuading people that there is a crisis, and therefore a crisis response needs to be made. Okay, and now I come to the third part of my talk, which is about Portugal. Here, I feel on less safe ground. I think you, the experts in the audience, probably know more about Portuguese migration than I do. But it does seem to me, and my headline is across the top of this slide, it does seem to me that, and I'm just going to read this out because it's a kind of phrase which I sort of wanted to put at the top of this slide, that perhaps no other country has a more intense engagement with migration and has experienced such a wide diversity of types of migration. So therefore, what I'm saying here is that Portugal is just a wonderful laboratory for the study of migration, because the kind of combination of history and geography here in Portugal gives it a fantastic variety of types of migration. I mean, not all of which, of course, are to be celebrated by no means. But it is a kind of statistical fact that, proportionate to its population, and with the sole exception of Malta, Portugal has the largest diaspora of any European country. Of course, that's a little bit contentious also, because it depends how you measure the diaspora, who is in the diaspora and who is not. How many generations of Portuguese heritage are measured when we talk about the Portuguese diaspora, or any diaspora for that matter. But it does seem to me that Portugal is a country where there is a longer established culture of migration in Portuguese society, and migration expresses itself as a kind of cultural structural constraint in Portuguese consciousness, in a way that, in a more exaggerated way, perhaps, than most other countries. And this is partly, I think, due to its geographical position. So I want to bring geography back here again. Its position on the southwest edge of Europe, its historical role as a colonial power, have combined to produce this extraordinary variety of migratory phenomenon, of emigrations and immigrations and return migrations, and also internal migrations as well. Those of us who study migration too easily overlook the importance of internal migration, which has transformed the population distribution in Portugal certainly over the last century or so. And so what we can say, and this is not just my phrase, it's used by other Portuguese migration experts as well, that Portugal's relationship with migration is essentially Janus-faced, looking both inwards to Europe, initially Western Europe, but nowadays also Eastern Europe in terms of new migration inflows, and outwards to North America as a traditional settler migration destination, and to its colonies in Latin America and Africa. And so we can see that Portugal has been both a sender and a receiver of major regional and global migration flows, often at the same time. And it's this simultaneity of migration phenomena, which is another part of the Portuguese migration story, which I find particularly fascinating. We have, through the history of colonialism, the so-called Lusophone migration system, which the late Maria Bagagna and many other Portuguese scholars have written about, and its simultaneous sending and receiving country character, a point that I'm going to pick up in the last couple of slides, which I'm coming to fairly shortly. And it's conventionally classified by writers such as Gois and Marques as a semi-peripheral country within the global migration system. I want to nuance that designation in just a few moments. And so here is a kind of history. I'm not going to go through this because time is maybe a little bit short, but here I've tried to set out by drawing, I mean, basically on the expertise of Portuguese migration scholars, many of whom are contained in this book that Cláudia Pereira and Joana Azevedo recently edited on new and old roots of Portuguese migration. And I was asked to write a kind of concluding chapter to that book. So partly this is based on what I tried to sort of put in that concluding chapter, all the different types of migration that, and maybe there are some that I've missed out, that Portugal has exhibited over its long historical engagement with migration. And again, summing up and drawing on these important authors, Bagagna, Gois and Marques, Peixoto, Malheiros, and so on, and the volume edited by Pereira and Azevedo. 4 chronological waves, and including especially the 4th wave, which I'm going to end up on now, and 4 spatial systems. The Lusophone migration system, in which there are complex 2-way movements developing, the North American system, the Western European system, and then most recently the Eastern European system, reflecting new immigration waves from countries like Poland and Ukraine and many others. So this is my concluding kind of trio of slides. It's some new work that I'm trying to think about, along with the work of 2 recent PhD theses that I've been privileged to supervise, that of Asaf Augusto from the University of Bayreuth on north-south Portuguese labor migration to Angola, and the thesis of Elisa Alves, which is due to be examined in a couple of weeks' time, on Angolan and Cape Verdean students migrating to Portuguese higher education. And I see the opportunity here to kind of develop what I regard as an overlooked aspect of migration studies, which is what I call reciprocal migration, which I define as the mutual exchange of origin and destination by 2 different migrating groups. And therefore, it's not the same as return migration. If you go back to Ravenstein and his laws of migration, he talks about every migration having a counter stream, which is basically a return migration. But with reciprocal migration, we are talking basically about 2 independent migration streams, which are kind of swapping origin and destination at the same time. And this is different from many other typologies of migration, which are temporally sequenced, or, you know, the transitions of migration that we're quite familiar with in migration studies, you know, the transition from internal to international migration through step migration, or the transition from emigration to return migration, or the transition of a whole country on a macro scale from an emigration country to an immigration country. Which is the transition that many Southern European countries have followed in recent decades. So my problematique, building on the recent PhD research of these 2 great PhD scholars, is to analyze the temporally simultaneous flows which take place between 2 countries, namely Portugal and Angola at the same time. And what I've tried to do in thinking through this with Asaf and Elisa is to develop 2 main, I think, theoretical frames to to try to explain this, or at least to frame this reciprocal migration. One is to investigate and nuance a little bit more the core periphery framework as applied to the Lusophone migration system. So I said before that Portugal has historically been seen as part of the Southern European periphery or semi-periphery. I mentioned before that Portugal was conventionally seen as a semi-peripheral country within the global migration system. And I would want to sort of slightly nuance that by labeling Portugal more as a semi-core country, because it is part of the European core, but it is also partly peripheral to that core because of its both historical and now contemporary exodus of Portuguese migrants to Europe in the 50s and 60s. It was mainly to France as labor migrants. Since 2008, it's been mainly a migration of younger, skilled, often graduates to, again, to those same countries, but also increasingly to new countries and above all, the UK. But it's also related to its history of colonialism. And so we have a new Portuguese wave of migration to Brazil, and in the case of this little research project that I'm developing, to Angola as well. So those are the reasons why I would relabel Portugal as a semi-core rather than a semi-peripheral country, or if you want to put it in a different terms, as a periphery within the core. And the same kind of logic, but in an inverse way, can be applied to Angola, which would, traditionally be seen as a peripheral country. But it's also a peripheral country which has a core function in that it is now the destination for labor migration flows from other countries, other neighboring African countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or China, or Brazil. It's also a receiving country. And therefore, I would relabel Angola as a semi-peripheral country, or if you like, as a core within the periphery, to reflect the complexity of this hierarchy of cores and peripheries and semi-peripheries, which is well established in the literature. And then the second theoretical frame is to delve into these new ideas about the coloniality of power as an expression of the ongoing relationship between these two countries, manifested in types of migration flow between them, and the way in which those migration flows are racialized, and the way in which skill is racialized, and culture and language and education in these two national contexts, and how these education and skill levels are projected onto the labor market in terms of the contrast of skilled white bodies, the phrase that I use at the bottom here, in Angola, in the sense of Portuguese migrants there, and unskilled black bodies in Portugal and also in Angola, and the way in which the racialization of the black body is seen as an unskilled labor migrant, as not as a high skilled person or as a graduate or a doctor or whatever. And so my last couple of slides are just some examples which I've shamelessly stolen from the theses of Asaf and Elisa. So firstly, some examples from Angola, where Portuguese migrants are all regarded as highly skilled, even when they have not got the qualifications to justify that. So we see that a Portuguese electrician, according to Asaf's fieldwork there, is called an engineer, and a Portuguese high school teacher can get a job as a university lecturer without having a PhD because of the hierarchization of education between the colonial metropole of Portugal on the one hand and the post-colonial periphery of Angola on the other. So there's this double trope of the good Portuguese expat worker who is seen as competent, reliable, and so on, and who often does not see himself or herself as a migrant, but as somebody who is here to help this country. And that's the voice of many of the migrants that were interviewed by Asaf. And which is also, to some extent, that mindset is internalized by the local African population who believe in this hierarchy, and that's part of the coloniality of power, which still exists in the Angolan context. And so we have a couple of quotes here to illustrate that. Teresa saying that, yes, I'm a lecturer in an Angolan university because she says these universities are at a much lower level than ones in Portugal, and therefore I can justify myself as a university lecturer, even though I only have a bachelor's degree, because the Angolan university system is seen to be so inferior. And then Daniel, a Black Angolan business owner, is talking about the prestige and also the economic payoff of him hiring a white Portuguese business manager, because that gives more credibility to his business in terms of securing loans from the bank and so on. And finally, my last slide, some examples from Portugal, which is kind of the inverse phenomenon. And I'll just maybe sort of summarize the quotes here in order to round off quickly. And so how the African students in Portuguese universities often feel themselves to be rejected as classmates, as project collaborators when groups of students form together, and as friends. I mean, this is not a universal phenomenon. Of course, there are good stories, there are positive relationships, there are many African students that were interviewed by ASAF spoke very warmly of their Portuguese lecturers, but many did not, and many did not in the way in which you can see here, whereby Alice, an Angolan student, is saying, you ask a question in class and they say they don't understand. They have this idea, which she says really pisses me off, that we are the ones who study the least. It's really boring when you are confident that you know your stuff and that you've completed your assignments. And then when Angolan students try to seek part-time work to support their studies, they are seen not as student workers, but they are seen through obviously the visibilization of their skin color as immigrants, as immigrant workers, and therefore the only jobs that they can offer are on construction sites or in supermarkets or McDonald's and so on. So this is work which is ongoing. I'd be grateful for any kind of further comments or advice on this. Thank you for listening. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but that's what I wanted to say. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Russell. In fact, geography is the best subject in the world, no doubts about it. So I'm very happy. This is an excellent message to all the students that are here, no doubts. Thanks for sharing your journey into geography and how important it is. And very good to have a job that gives us pleasure, the opportunity to explore the world, to travel through your stamp collection, cycling. It's very important. And also Portugal is in fact an excellent laboratory for migration studies, and your views are really very, very important, and the new concepts and theories that you are exploring, introducing this new concept of reciprocal migration is really very, very important, and you should explore it. But of course, we don't have many time, but since we started with a delay, I would like to ask if anyone has any question or comment before we go. Joaquin, yes, please.
30 seconds. To congratulate Russell for a beautiful and touching presentation, and thanking him for sharing it with us. To say that I feel sorry that I am too old to change my discipline. Had I heard this presentation 50 years ago, maybe I would have become a geographer.
Thank you, Joaquin. And it's also, we are very fortunate because since Russell was so generous to share with us his journey into geography, you can see he is really the role model for a geographer, you know? And look how important teachers are. As he mentioned in his case. So, in fact, it's very, very inspiring for all of us. Okay, Elisa. You can come here if you want. No, but for the people that is at home. You can come here. Otherwise, the others. Okay.
And I leave the mask,
Online.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hi again. Thank you, Russell, for being here. And I'm very delighted for you having shared your experience and a very inspired experience. And also thank you for sharing our joint paper with Azaf. But my main question is, if you can share a bit with us, how do you organize your day, your week? Because I think that's the hardest part for most of us. So if you can share just a bit of that, your secret for the success. Thank you.
Yeah, you are really a role model. No doubt.
Okay, I let you into my secret, okay? I never sleep.
Yeah. Any other question or comment? So, well, we have a very tight schedule this morning. So let's go for a coffee and please come back in 15 minutes. Okay, so we go to the conference room. Thank you very much, Russell. It was really excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I must put in touch with my colleague Diogo, which in fact is sick. That's why he isn't here today. He has a huge friend collection. Yeah, Diogo, yes. Ah, yeah. Okay, so see you later.
Yeah. 5:30.
Yeah.
Just need to retrieve.
Yeah.
Can you just take yes, see where it is?
Okay, okay, good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be here at this incredibly special edition of the EGOT conference, held in honor of Professor Alan Williams and Professor Russell King, who we heard this morning. Thanks, Russell, for an amazing presentation. First of all, thank you to Professor José Manuel Simões for the invitation to be here. So to begin with, I want to sort of talk to you a little bit about our intention for the session this morning. We want to share some of the recent research that we've undertaken in the research group MIGRARE, which is a research group here at the Centre for Geographical Studies, which is coordinated by Professor Maria Lucinda Fonseca, who's here in the front row. So to begin with, I want to talk you through an overview of the main themes that we've developed as a research group over the sort of recent past. And then I'm going to give the floor to my colleagues, to Professor Jorge Milhares, who will talk to you on migration and demographic dynamics. Then we're going to go live to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where Franz Burr will talk to you on privilege mobilities. And then last but not least, my colleague Alina Esteves will give a presentation on migration and the reconfiguration of rural areas. Okay, so just to give you a broad overview of the work that we've been doing in the MIGRARE research group, we've really sort of structured our work around 5 broad areas. So the first area relates to migration drivers, systems and trajectories. So one of the most significant projects that we've worked on as a team in the recent past was the Stemish Project, which was funded by Norface. And the objective of the project was to really investigate what makes people decide to migrate. So we asked sort of under what conditions moves by pioneer migrants result in the expansion of migration systems, and under which conditions does this not actually happen. So this was a comparative study of the evolution of migration trajectories from Brazil, Morocco, and Ukraine to cities in European countries, in the UK, Norway, the Netherlands, and of course here in Portugal. And the results of this project, here we have photos of our research team implementing a survey in Brazil under the leadership of Professor Maria Lucinda Fonseca. But the research results highlighted the importance of migrant networks, but also other factors beyond networks in perpetuating migration streams. So macro level factors and also broadcast feedback that operates through impersonal networks to initiate and perpetuate and then also reverse migration movements. So in other projects, we've also continued this line of research through the study of complex migration trajectories. And one of our PhD students, Philip Young, he is doing research. He's currently studying South-South migration. So he's looking at migration from Senegal to Brazil, and then further onward migration from Brazil to other places. And he's trying to understand how migration aspirations develop, but also change along the migration process. Another example is recent research on migrants from the Punjab in northern India to Lisbon. And this is normally a secondary movement from within the European Union, which is sort of tied to the search for a regular pathway into Europe. But since favorable migration policy in Portugal isn't often paired with easy economic migration for these migrants, onward migration is often used as an individual strategy so that they can realize their integration projects in other EU countries. In terms of drivers, so we've looked at various different types of migration and mobilities along the recent past, but I wanted to highlight more recent work in the area of student and youth mobility. So this has been developed mostly by Professor Lucinda Fonseca and various PhD students, so Juliana Iorio, Veronica Silva, and Elisa Alves, who's supervised, of course, by Russell King. And this work really interrogates the motivations, integration, also the aspirations of students and social representations as well, from different origins. Another area relates to Mediterranean mobilities. So in the context of AMISCO, we're currently participating in the Euromed research network on migration. And this network really tries to bring together scholars sort of from the north and the south of the Mediterranean basin to sort of co-produce and exchange knowledge, and trying to move away from a Eurocentric approach on Mediterranean migration across the Mediterranean. So now moving on to the second main theme, so is work on transnationalism and diaspora. Really sort of this work on transnationalism is transversal and really permeates a lot of our research projects. But recently we've looked at the role of transnational social protection and how migrants develop this through their migration projects. And this work was really developed in the context of the Mobile Welfare Project, which was funded by Norface and led by the University of Oxford. And our local team was led by Professor Lucinda. And the Mobile Welfare Project really aimed to understand the role of welfare systems in 6 destination and origin countries. And this was really sort of timely in response to the political rhetoric that has been developing around the idea of benefit tourism and the politicization of migration and migration motivations. And the project really contested the welfare magnet thesis and showed that migrants instead develop quite complex assemblages of social protection. So using a kind of form of transnational bricolage between sort of resources in the origin country and also in destination countries as well. It's showing this book that Russell has already talked about today. So work on new and old roots of Portuguese immigration and transnational practices is another key aspect, but I'm going to sort of skirt over this because George Milhares is going to talk about this just in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to move straight on to migration and city making. So this is really an area that aggregates quite a large proportion of our research. So I had lots of little sort of topics around this, and it was really hard to condense them because it's an important area of research for the group. And there's really a sort of strong history of research on housing and segregation within the research group. That includes earlier seminal publications in the Southern European context on migration and urban change by Jorge Milhares and also Lucinda Fonseca. So the first study that I want to point out is a study that was already conducted 10 years ago by Fonseca and Milhares on access to housing, which included experimental research on discrimination in the housing market. But it was a really important foundation for work that we've developed more recently, including the project on the socio-spatial integration of religious minorities, which looks at integration and residential processes of religious minorities in the city, looking at how migrant spaces are produced through sort of asynchronous appropriation of space through different migration flows that also determine migrant pathways and residential trajectories through the city. Another important body of work relates to spatial integration. I suppose this started with a rather substantial comparative neighborhood study, XII that we conducted from 2009 onwards. And this was conducted in 6 cities on interethnic relations as a dimension of urban social integration. And the whole consortium of the project was coordinated by Professor Lucinda Fonseca. But developing a different notion of urban integration, Franz Baer advanced the idea that to be integrated into urban space, one has to be able to sort of navigate it and also be aware of its resources. So Franz's PhD work, which was developed in the Marie Curie network, Intergreen, really explored migrant spatial integration in the city by looking at the way migrants learned how to use the city, and he put forward the concept of urban pedagogies as well. Now moving to integration into labor markets. XII is one of the projects that I wanted to highlight here. And this is a project that was coordinated by Alina Esteves. I'm here in the mesa with me in the table. Sorry, I'm mixing Portuguese and English. And XII really aimed to study the impacts of the financial crisis on livelihoods and on labor market incorporation of migrants. So through this study, our colleagues here, who you can see their paper, Alina Esteves, Lucinda Fonseca, and Jorge Milhares, they identified the coping tactics and strategies that migrants used in order to overcome the precarity and risks associated with the last crisis. And these strategies sort of ranged from informal work to return migration to onward migration to other European countries to try and achieve integration in another destination, which sort of contrasts with nation state understandings or nation state bound understandings of integration. Now moving swiftly along to privileged mobilities. So another important line of research that we're currently working on is privileged mobilities. And this was really in response to the diversification of different types of lifestyle and investment migration to the city of Lisbon. And first of all, PRIMOB, I want to talk to you a little bit about PRIMOB, which is a research and a mystical research initiative that was created in 2019. And really the objective of PRIMOB is to bring researchers working on different forms of privileged migration. So retirement, lifestyle, investment, amenity migration, entrepreneurial elite, etc. And the objective was to try and bring privileged mobilities into the sort of mainstream of migration studies, because it really says a lot about inequality in mobility regimes. And actually at the beginning, Russell was the first person outside of EGOT who I shared the proposal with when we were writing the proposal, and he got on board straight away. So it's safe to say that, Russell, you were the first PRIMOB member before it even had a name. Another aspect that we've been working on is integration of Swedish migrants in Portugal, which is a line of work that's been developed by Alina Esteves and our colleague Daniel Rahut. And they've been looking at belonging and quality of life and integration of these migrants in Portugal in different territories across the country. Also, this work has been, of course, very much inspired by the pioneering study of Russell King and Alan Williams, Sunset Lives, that I think they're going to talk about a little bit later on. We've attempted also in other research to study motivations and locational choice, first from the perspective of the elite intermediate economy, and then work more recently with migrants, with urban lifestyle migrants, specifically looking at their locational choice, and the impact of past mobility and tourism experiences and imaginaries. Okay, Franz will also go a little bit more in depth into privileged mobilities to the city and also transnational gentrification in just a second. Okay. And last but not least is the question of rural migration and demographic dynamics. Okay, oops, this is the wrong order. Okay. So one main aspect that Alina Esteves will speak to you in more depth about is work that's been done around the global countryside, okay? And by Alina, our colleague Luís Moreno, and also Professor Lucinda Fonseca, building on her earlier work. And this research really looks at how globalizing processes and mobility are transforming particular rural places. But I'll leave this to Alina, who's going to elaborate a little bit more in a second. And in terms of local development and rural mobilities, including return migration, we have the MIGRARE project, which is a project that was developed by Amandine Deziel and was funded by Marie Curie Actions. And this project, which is actually just finished, provided new tools for supporting the return of Portuguese migrants to Trás-Montes, a region close to the Spanish border, with a view really to sort of strengthening the local social fabric and developing the local economy. And Amandine has produced this amazing film as one of the research outputs. So I would encourage you to watch that. And the film sort of really looks from a migrant perspective on how return migrants and members of the diaspora boost the local economy. So now looking ahead, so not in the sense of sort of aspirations or sort of long-term plans, but looking just to sort of the imminent start of a new research project that we're going to start in January. And I wanted to mention this because this really brings us to it brings us close to a new agenda that we hope will be really fulcral and central in the future of the work that we do in MIGRARE, and that's the relationship between migration and climate change. So we have a new project that will start in January, which is called the Acting Project, and it's funded by the Green Deal and coordinated by the European Science Foundation and here in EGOT by Lucinda Fonseca. And Acting will mobilize research experimentation with the aim of trying to foster a socially just Green Deal to try and safeguard the inclusion of vulnerable groups such as migrants in the green transition. So that's looking to the immediate future. So now, without further ado, I'm going to pass you to my colleague Jorge Milhares, who's going to talk more in depth about immigration and demographic dynamics. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good morning to all of you. So I thank to Jennifer the general overview and introduction to our research at MIGRARE. I will talk about this area. It won't be about a specific project on immigration or particular development on the issues of, let's say, population or population geography. It will also be a kind of view of the lines that we have been following in this domain and that we have been exploring at MIGRARE. Oops. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we can say that this is a classical line of research. Actually, if you look into the goals of MIGRARE nowadays, most of them have the word immigration, and they are associated to immigrants in Portugal and in Europe. But there is a classical line of research which involves Portuguese immigration, which started before immigration, when Portugal was not a country of immigration, and which has been explored here by some of our more established researchers, and which were pioneers in this area of population geography and immigration, and which are connected to MIGRARE. And also there is a link between migration and demographic studies, which is also explored by some of us at MIGRARE. I want to bring you to researchers, to women researchers, now that, and this is important now that EGOT and Centre of Geographical Studies try to enhance equality of gender, to show that for a long time, very good geographers were exploring this area since the 1960s and 1970s or the 1980s. So the first example is Professora Carminda Cavaco, which, well, actually she stopped being a member of MIGRARE very recently, and she was an important person in the pioneer studies about Portuguese population. We can say that there is a triangle of work developed by Carminda Cavaco, which started with population studies, then it expanded to agriculture, which was a very strong element in his analysis. She is a pioneer in the studies of Portuguese agriculture and processes of change within joining the European Union, at the time the European Economic Community in the 1980s. So the transformation of Portuguese agriculture in those days. And then she became an important expert in tourism studies. Actually, for the past 20 or 30 years, it has been in tourism. And this is an example of a book where she merges tourism and demographics. She has worked strongly in the area of tourism, though from time to time she works also issues of population, for instance. And then there is Professor Lucinda Fonseca, who is the coordinator of MIGRARE since the group was established, I think, in 2004, 2005. And she pioneered work in the domain of Portuguese immigration and Portuguese internal migration. This is the cover of her thesis, which is, we can say, a seminal study on the issues of population mobility in the country, and on a novel analysis that merges geographical, at least in Portugal, that merges geographical mobility with social mobility and tries to show how geographical mobility is important in the processes of the mobility ladder, as we usually call it. So this is before MIGRARE, but as we can see, for the links of these two researchers with MIGRARE, the issue or the seeds were already there when MIGRARE established in the early 2000s. Something wrong. Oh. Okay. When we look into the, and this is in Portuguese because it's how we have put this in our frame. When we look into the big research lines targeting, well, the big research lines of MIGRARE, these are the ones where we can identify a little bit of immigration issues. So it's international migrations and labor markets. So we look also into the Portuguese, into international market migration and in the European labor markets, both at regional level in various places, and at the EU processes of internal mobility and this relation with the labor markets. Secondly, the issue of regional development, it has been addressed now in the format of transnationalism, but there are several researches, and I'll show a couple of them in a minute, which try to connect migration and regional development, especially the impact of migration in regional development. The most classical thing is the studies about remittances, but then we have remittances, financial remittances, but then we have all the other kinds of remittances which are being explored now, and which involve, let us say, emotional remittances, trade remittances, and let us say brain remittances or knowledge remittances, to be more correct and specific. And then there are the connected area, which is diasporas and transnational communities. So this line of research, which is based in, let us say, a new approach between commas that developed since the 1990s, first recovering the word diasporas and make it a different use of it in the context of migration studies, and then the development of this idea of transnationalism and transnational communities that started in the late 80s and 90s and early 1990s. Okay, so two big lines under this issue of demography and immigration. One is new Portuguese immigration and relations with Portuguese society. I think Russell has spoken about this earlier. I regret I wasn't here at the time, but there was a little problem and I couldn't make it. I apologize for that. And the two projects were REMIGRE, the one that has been called, that's been mentioned also by Jennifer, which was first when Portuguese immigration. So we try to address issues that are relevant also for Portuguese society. So when immigration resumed 10 years ago, well, it started maybe five to 6 years before, but it resumed and it became an issue in Portuguese society, and the figures increased to levels which were closer to the ones that we experienced in the late 60s. We, a group of us, proposed a research project, which was actually funded by the Foundation for Science and Technology, about this issue of new immigration. And We wanted, because we didn't know at the time, what were the features of this immigration. One of the issues was just skilled migration, or was it more diversified? And clearly, it was not just skilled migration, obviously more skilled than the Portuguese migration of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but not majority. Not majority of immigrants are actually skilled migrants. There are a lot of medium skilled and even low skilled migrants involved in the process. And the other thing was the relationship of these migrants with Portuguese society. Was it just temporary migration? Are there specific transnational links? What is the impact in terms of connections? Then the project developed in a second stage, which was about return. And what we try to do, if there is effective expectations of return from these migrants, what challenges do they face when they try to return in terms of social connections, uses of the capital they had, and also if return is a physical issue, or it can be something that involves virtual elements, a kind of virtual return and connections using the virtual platforms to connect with Portugal, and in a certain way to participate in the activities in Portuguese society, which is a project that is not finished yet. The first one was coordinated by João Peixoto at XII, University of Lisbon, and the second one at our colleague José Carlos Marques at Leiria Polytechnic. And this one is a project which will be finished in the next 6 months. And then it's always important to mention, as Jennifer has done, the projects which are developed by PhD students. And one of the examples is Sandra Silva with her project on descendants in the diaspora. So it's not just the new immigration, it's also the Portuguese descendants, second, third, eventually fourth generations, and their connections with the country. So when we talk about transnationalism or diasporas, we don't mean just migrants, we mean also other people, descendants of migrants, even people at the destination spaces, which are connected to the global network, in this case of Portuguese. So these are some of the elements that we explore, and we try to contribute to these areas: features and trends of Portuguese immigration, diaspora and identity issues, for instance, explored in the case of the descendants of the Portuguese, and transnational connections. I think I'll move faster. This is the second line of research, which is demographic challenges, demographic sustainability, and regional development in Portugal. Project P-RIDE, which was presented by Jennifer before, which is now already eating my head, saying that I don't have more time. So this is a relevant project about mobilities, and especially if demography is a real hindrance for development of Portuguese regions. Then there is a project MIGSUB, which is more or less in the same line and tries to explore if the aging process of Portuguese society and the loss of population that we experienced for the past 10 years are really hindrances in the case of the prospects of Portuguese development and the prospects of development of Portuguese regions. Then another project is this one on natality, on births. And this was a project about, there is no migration here, only indirectly. This is a project about policies for natality. We have a negative natural balance? No, natural balance. Okay, we have a negative natural balance since, well, the late 2009, I think, around that. So we are losing population as many other European countries. This has contributed to aging. We are one of the countries in Europe with the lowest fertility rates. And there is a wide discussion about how can we increase fertility rates, or how can we increase births. And this was a study on policies and the results of policies, or which policies should we implement in this area. And one of the conclusions is that policies that target specifically fertility normally are less efficient than policies which are more structural and target, for instance, labor market or parentality rights. And then, and this will connect with what Alina is saying, there is something that we're trying to develop now, which is a project about the demographic hindrances and its problems in the low density regions, the interior of the country, and in the divergence between these regions and the littoral or the developed littoral areas, namely the Lisbon metropolitan area and Porto. Sorry. How this moves? Desculpa, mas eu não consigo andar com isto. Como? Obrigado. Thanks. Okay, and then another example, also in this area, PhD projects, PhD of Teresa Santos, which is here at the room, and which tries to explore Portuguese immigration and development in Portugal, having a broad conception of development, which is not just centered in financial issues or the usual classic GDP, regional GDP increase. Now, final notes on what all this thing means. So we try to research on contemporary demographic processes which are relevant for Portuguese society, and we try to forecast between commas to make projections about this for the future. There is a clear privilege of interdisciplinary approaches. All these projects involve sociologists, economists, and others. They are developed in cooperation with other Portuguese research centers. So we can say that we provide the look and the contribution of geography. It's not just the issue of regional development, but also we could discuss what is the geographical approach. We can use the two old questions which are based where things happen and why they happen there. Then the third issue, it's mainly applied research, but we try to depart from applied research to develop conceptual and theoretical, or the conceptual, theoretical, and methodological perspectives. For instance, the idea of transnational socio-geographic spaces, the perspectives of north-south migration, which has been mentioned here, or replacement migration in Southern European contexts, for instance. Then there is this very important link to the training of young researchers and to the opportunities of young researchers. That's why several researchers which conduct the PhDs are important in each of these areas. Finally, we try to contribute to policy making. So there are the scientific outputs, the classical ones in journals and chapter books and etc. But we try also to incorporate contributions in non-scientific publications, which have a wider audience. We try to contribute to media and texts in media, both short ones and longer media texts. And we have dialogue with institutions. For instance, we have a membership of the Observatory of Emigration, which collects data on immigration, but also spreads news about Portuguese immigration connected to research. So I think this is what we try to do in these areas. Thank you very much. And sorry for the 2 extra minutes that I took, or 3, or I don't know.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you, George. Now we'll move on to our next presentation, which will be made by Franz Burr on privileged mobilities. So Franz, the floor is over to you.
Let me just see. Can you see my presentation and can you hear me?
Yeah, Franz, we can see and hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. Bom dia, good morning to everyone. It's a pity I cannot be there with you in person and have to resort to this old-fashioned technology called Zoom. I prepared a very short presentation where I'm gonna try to kind of situate some reflections about migration and urban change within the context what we have been looking at MIGRARE, and maybe this will work as a sort of bridge also between the discussions we had yesterday and today. So to talk about migration and urban change is not new at all. Migrants have historically played a key role in terms of social, economic, and spatial change within cities. And the kind of research that MIGRARE unit does here in Portugal is testament to that. My colleagues, as Jennifer had mentioned before, have written extensively about the ways migration has reshaped urban landscapes in Portugal, how migrants have settled in more or less segregated patterns in Lisbon, and other topics. But today, when we look at the debates taking place around urban change, especially in Lisbon, the main conceptual explanation for understanding urban change is tourism. And again, our colleagues here at GOT have helped us identify how tourism and over-tourism especially have impacted deeply local housing dynamics, local retail systems, and the city's very soundscape. Indeed, when we look at data like this one, let me. Oh, sorry. Let me. Yeah, now it's working. So when we look at data like this one, the number of airport arrivals in Lisbon, which more than doubled in the past 10 years, or data like this, where you see the density of entire apartments listed on Airbnb and how they concentrate in the city center. And, oh, sorry. And in turn, how housing costs in the central areas have more than doubled in the past 5 years. We are evidently faced with overwhelming evidence about the effects of tourism in local urban dynamics. And when we look at this year's census data, which has only been partially released, we see that the historic city center of Lisbon has lost a lot of its population, even when compared to other over-touristed areas in cities like Barcelona or Athens, for example. So the evidence of the impact of tourism in the city is evident, and the city's population does not need to see this data to understand that. They feel that, they see that in their everyday lives. But what we have been doing here at MIGRARE, and that's something that Jennifer was really able to capture in her presentation, is that we are looking here perhaps at more discrete forms of mobility that partially intersect with tourism. The magnitude of tourism numbers may partially overshadow or obscure other parallel and coexisting mobilities, perhaps less visible at first sight, but very much present and far less studied. For instance, when we look at the migrants, the numbers of migrants currently registered in Lisbon, in this slide, we see that in early 2008, we saw a very post-colonial pattern of migration, where Brazilians were the first population and migrants coming from Portuguese-speaking African countries were the second. But now we see a complete change, where intra-European migration is far more represented. And although Brazilians still remain very much present, the socio-demographics within the Brazilian migrant population has also changed a lot. My colleagues here at MIGRARE have already pointed out that the share of middle class and upper middle class individuals and families, Brazilian retirees, investors, and young Brazilian is increasing beyond the traditional labor migration patterns of before. And also these numbers that I'm showing you here from CEF are probably underrepresented as well, as many intra-European migrants do not register locally after the 3-month deadline that they are supposed to. But there is still other migrant populations that are very hard to track or to quantify, not only in Portugal, but everywhere. I think the most paradigmatic example are probably the digital nomads, who are professionals who work while traveling or travel while working. You see here that not only Lisbon, but Portugal as a whole has entered the list of the cool destinations for digital nomads. This is one of the most famous online guides to digital nomadism, and Lisbon comes up first in the list, but Madeira is also there, Porto is also there, and Ericeira too. And alongside digital nomads, other kinds of mobile populations have been increasingly attracted to Lisbon's as they say, sun exposure or cheap cost of life, inverted commas, and quirky hilly streets. Again, my colleagues here at MIGRARE have begun to look at lifestyle migration, residential mobilities, retirement migration, student mobilities, or youth mobilities more broadly, as Russell King points out. And of course, these populations have not come to Lisbon or Portugal by chance. They have been actively sought for, and they are embedded into various privileged mobilities regimes that have been created to support, created or supported by public and private initiatives. I don't have a lot of time to go through each of these initiatives that function more or less as the main pillars structuring this regime. I'd just like to say a few words about the Non-Habitual Resident Program, created in 2009, which aims to attract talent in high value-added activities such as tech, creative industries, and finance. And the famous Golden Visa program that also gives tax benefits to investors and foreigners buying real estate. But also the change of the Web Summit base city from Dublin to Lisbon, the creation of this startup ecosystem that has been attracted a lot of startup and tech companies to Lisbon, and the people who work, the transnational talent working for those companies. But as I said before, some of these transient populations are hard to be tracked or to be quantified through the use of available census tools. But emerging exploratory research has found that some of these populations gravitate toward specific consumption geographies, whether residential or commercial. I brought here some pictures of businesses established in the last 4 to 5 years in Lisbon, to give you an overview of the place consumption patterns of these privileged and mobile populations. Actually, there are many pictures. These ones, pretty similar, and these ones. Each picture is from a different place, and they could easily be taken as restaurants or coffee shops targeting wealthier tourists or local gentrifiers. But what do these places have in common, besides having a clear predilection for the use of plants as part of their interior decoration? Well, all of these shops and cafes, all of them in these pictures and restaurants, are not only frequented by lifestyle migrants, but they are also owned by lifestyle migrants. They are owned by French, Brazilian, Ukrainian, Australian, or Russian migrants who moved to Lisbon to open a business here, but also to enjoy a particular lifestyle. These shops show us how privileged mobilities also create their own urban infrastructures and the ways of sustaining their lifestyles and place consumption practices. This is something my colleague Philip Young and I explored in a Horizon 2020 project at MIGRARE called Diaspora Link a few years ago, which just came up as a research article in the Mobilities Journal that Jennifer showed you. So these businesses tell us about how new formats of migrant entrepreneurship beyond the stereotypical ethnic business enclave, and how migrants' businesses also participate in wider patterns of commercial gentrification. And most of these coffee shops that I'm showing you are also co-working spaces where remote workers, digital nomads, and Erasmus students work from while drinking specialty coffee, while tourists have brunch and avocado toasts, and young Portuguese influencers take pictures for their Instagram accounts. In fact, while in 2015, so not very long ago, there were only two specialty coffee shops in Lisbon. And by the end of last year, by the end of 2020, only 5 years later, there were more than 60 of them. And similar patterns happen with co-working spaces, co-living places, and other urban infrastructure that kind of facilitate or even enable the maintenance of mobile lifestyles. So I just wanted to conclude and try to kind of pinpoint this recent developments in urban studies, claiming precisely for a broader recognition of the mobilities which partially overlap with tourism in terms of place consumption and their local impacts. And here I have in mind Johannes Novi's work about Berlin, which I think has many similarities to what's going on in Lisbon. In other words, this line of research calls for an exploration of the entanglement between lifestyle migration, tourism, and commercial gentrification. So what we think is that doing so is to understand that these mobile lifestyles and tourism actually cross-fertilize each other, not only in terms of their local geography, so understanding where these populations choose to live, to buy, and to eat, but also in terms of the creation of specific leisure-related imaginaries about cities and about Lisbon more specifically. I think I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Franz, for a really inspiring presentation. Now, last but not least, I'm going to pass the floor to Alina Esteves, and she's going to talk to you about labour migration to rural areas. Okay.
Good morning to everybody. This is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the organization to invite us to present our results of research that we've been conducting at MIGRARE Research Group. The paper I'm bringing today is something that has been already published in the Journal of Population, Space and Place, and it's a joint paper of Professor Lucinda Fonseca, our colleague Luís Moreno, and myself. The paper is an output of the Peer Right project, a project that has already been mentioned before. It's regional, the acronym means the Regional Integration of Demography and Economy. And besides conducting fieldwork for this paper, specifically for this paper, we also drew on knowledge that the team had of this municipality of Odmira since the XII project that has already been mentioned. So in a nutshell, the goals of our research are to shed some light on the reconfiguration of the municipality of Odmira. This reconfiguration has been led by the transformative role of international laborers and lifestyle migrants. So it's a municipality that brings together not only workers, but also lifestyle migrants looking for the good life, or the pleasant life, retirement life. But also that transformative role is feasible in the economic, social, and demographic fabric of this rural place. It is indeed a rural place. Another goal was to show the strategies devised by local actors in the accommodation of new demands in the fields of language and housing. We looked into very different fields, but we have to reduce our scope and focus on language and housing, although other challenges were also visible. These demands were taken place in a context of growing demand of produce, namely small red berries, cut flowers and salads, but also in the context of amenity migration and enforcement of strict environmental regulations concerning land use. Sorry, it's the previous one. Oh yeah, okay. So the perspective adopted in this paper is framed by the literature on the local turn, global countryside, and integration and accommodation at the local level of a very diversified population, not just diversified in terms of feature, but also in terms of needs, of specific needs. Yeah, okay, that's the one. So as Professor Russell King mentioned before, globalization is a process that is taking place today, presently. And it's not like a veil or a shroud that comes from above, as sometimes we think it might be, as if descending upon places. Globalization happens through places. And it's precisely the articulation and negotiation of local politics with global forces, leading to small incremental changes within localities, including the fusing together of local and global entities that produce these new hybrid entities. And one of these new hybrid entities is Odmira municipality. And how can we see this globalization taking place through places? According to the neo-endogenous development perspective, not only are immigrants business creators, increasing income and employment through entrepreneurship, as we were able to see in Odmira, but also building their connections beyond the rural localities where they reside. And it was precisely these connections that we were so interested in when we conducted fieldwork, not only in the XII project, but also for this specific paper. However, accommodating people from very different groups with very distinct needs and interests is a big challenge at the local level. Not just at the local level, but we could see that in Odmira, the competing interests were really struggling for power. Farmers, agribusiness corporation, laborers, lifestyle migrants, and non-farming residents have different visions on how the land and the territory should be managed. And this has already been found by Ricardo Morén-Alegret, our colleague here, and Professor Fonseca when they conducted fieldwork in 2017 and 18, and they precisely in this territory, identifying that conflicts become more palpable if environmental regulations pertaining to natural parks and protected sites are enforced. And Odmira is precisely one of those places where a substantial part of the territory is part of the natural park and Natura network. So accommodating differences can be conflictual and imbalanced, requiring a permanent negotiation resilience on the part of all players. So you use the case of Odmira, a rural place in a very peripheric position in Portugal. It takes ages to get there by car, even by car. And in the next sessions, we will show that local actors are active agents involved in incorporating, manipulating and adapting globalizing forces of change rather than passive recipients. In terms of data and methodology, we collected data from the Aliens and Border Surface and also from Statistics Portugal. We conducted during the XII project qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews, a focus group, and later on, when we updated the documentation or the data for this specific paper, we conducted some interviews with local farmers. Just to give you some pictures or some features of the Odmira municipality, it's the largest municipality in Portugal. It's very sparsely populated. It has an aging and declining Portuguese population. As I said before, 44% of its territory is part of a natural park and Natura network, which brings obviously very restrictive land uses leading to conflicts. But at the same time, it has good soil, mild climate, lots of water available, at least for the moment being, and it has attracted national and foreign investment in terms of companies producing salads, small berries and cut flowers. A substantial part of this produce is for export. In terms of change and globalization, that was the main focus of our attention. Two major strands of migrants can be found in Odmira. A larger group composed by laborers coming from Southeast Asia, namely Thais, also people from the Hindustani Peninsula, Indians and Nepalese, and also Eastern European citizens coming from Romania and Bulgaria. And also a less diversified strand of people coming from Germany, the Netherlands and UK. These are people who are often CEOs of international corporate farming, but also people who are looking for the good life. And they are looking at Odmira as a quiet coastal retreat or a place of spiritual fulfillment. And I'd like to bridge here, to make a bridge with between our work and the Professor Russell King work in a very recent paper published by King, Lul and Melossi in the Journal of Rural Studies in 2021. They refer that one of the cross-cutting themes is the new geographies of migration. And now I'm quoting, these new geographies of migration, there are demands for extra labor, leading to the formation of wider geographic areas of free movement, notably from the European Union and the Schengen area. These authors also mentioned the long-distance flows that are created between countries that are not necessarily related to each other. And they are referring to the ties in Sweden, the Sub-Saharan Africans in southern Italy, and the Nepalese in Portugal. So that special issue from the Journal of Rural Studies also includes another paper by Claudia Pereira and colleagues from XIT about Odmira. And it's precisely by engaging in these international flows that Odmira became a global agriculture enclave in full force into the global agri-food supply chains. This has caused considerable challenges in terms of real estate prices. It increased remarkably, but also other challenges that we will focus in a minute. Just to give you some pictures about the location of Odmira. Odmira is in the coastal area of Alentejo, where you can see the little white circle. There's also a table with the population change. And in the case of Portugal, the population is decreasing, but also in terms of Odmira. But the contribution of foreigners to mitigate that population loss is remarkable indeed. In 2019, 1/3 of documented foreign citizens accounted for the total population. Now in 2020, foreign documented citizens represent 39% of the total population. However, these figures that the Aliens and Border Service show are far from being the reality. There's a much higher presence of undocumented, well, people who probably are undocumented, but also of seasonal workers that flock to the region in the peak of the farming seasons. In terms of challenges, and that's the next slide, thank you, Jennifer. This diversity brought about challenges in the fields of housing, conflict of land use and language and communication, just to name a few. We identified many more challenges, but just to give you an idea about language and communication, although there are Portuguese language classes, one of the people that we interviewed said that, for example, for a Thai worker, learning Portuguese is not the same as for a Bulgarian worker, who after a couple of months in Portugal can communicate. Thais struggle a lot with language and are much more closed. Another quotation from the Deputy Mayor of Social Issues in Odmira, she said, Portuguese natives, lifestyle migrants and labor migrants know very little about each other, which may foster alienation and even prejudiced ideas about each other. So language is really a challenge in terms of being able to communicate. Another challenge that we identified is conflicts on land use. New projects, according to the opinion of a local farmer, new projects that have been submitted are endlessly pending for a response for the national agencies supervising natural parks, preventing business growth. So you have, on the one hand, natural park regulations, and on the other hand, the pressure of local producers to increase arable land. In terms of housing, and that's one of the big issues underpinning all our fieldwork, local authorities want to mediate in the solution of finding more dwellings, according to the Deputy Mayor dealing with social issues, but cannot change much in the field of territorial management due to the set of laws applicable to the region, like the natural park, the irrigation perimeter, or the National Ecological Reserve. So just to make this long story short, because I only have 2 minutes, I'll just go to the local endeavors to accommodate diversity. So the municipality has 2 local integration plans. It has a municipal immigrant commission that brings together several representatives from immigrants, local authorities, and police forces. There is also celebration of National Days performances in order to bring together migrants and Portuguese people. There is also a local center for migrant integration sponsored by the High Commission for Migration with a community outreach. That local center for migrant integration is sponsored, it's paid, it's funded both by the state authorities and also by private companies. There's also an international project Growing Together that attracted migrant parents to schools, and the pressure made by local producers was able to reclassify containers as complementary structures of farming activity in order to increase the amount of housing, even if it's temporary housing for workers. And now, final remarks. what we were able to conclude was that local schools have been able to present more adequate responses to migrant children, adapting their curricula to the children's features. There have been some provisions in the field of housing, or language, Portuguese language classes, but they were insufficient. What we would like to do in the future is to understand how far producers associations and agribusiness corporations can lobby for their interests, pushing forward projects concerning good quality housing for workers, expansion of irrigated area for farming, and better public services for newcomers. And also we would like to look at this in the post-COVID outbreaks that took place, that were visible this year and that we saw in the media in May and June, that revealed very poor housing conditions for migrants who were considering essential workers in the region. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina, for a really rich presentation. So I think that we'll have to abdicate question time because we're really over schedule. But I hope that the session gave you some insight into the type of research that we've been conducting in MIGRARE. And I'd like to thank Professor Jorge Milhares, Franz Burr, and Professor Alina Esteves for their contributions. And thank you very much to colleagues and students for your attention. Okay, now we'll pass to the round table. So I invite Lucinda and Fonseca to okay, I've received counter indications here, sorry, that we have a little bit of time available for questions. So if anybody would like to make a comment or ask a question, then please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much to all of you. It was really nice. I had a quick question for France regarding the impact of the pandemic restrictions on privileged migration and in digital nomads in particular in Lisbon, and if there was any research, anything you could tell us about that.
Thanks, Emma. You hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you, Franz.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Amandine, for this question. It's still hard to tell because, as I said, these populations are very hard to track and to understand their specialities. But we are, because the results the pictures and the reflections I presented in my presentation are from like a research that Philip and I conducted 2 years ago, and now I'm also working for the Smart Desk project in the Território research group, and we are really looking into that now at the intersection between also migration and tourism. And the pandemic has it seems that it has made Lisbon even more popular among digital nomads because we could see, I think, in newspapers many reportages about how people sometimes working remotely and as remote work became more popular also came to Portugal, for instance, last year when some of the restrictions were a little bit lighter here compared to other European countries, and many people came here to enjoy working from outdoor spaces, and so we are trying to focus on that, but we haven't really much results to show. That's going to be available, I think, at the end of the Smart Desk project.
Thank you, Franz. And maybe we have time for one more question before we close the session. If anybody, Russell, please.
Yeah, Franz, I'd also like to ask you a question, if I may, which kind of develops this line of conversation that we have been having about lifestyle migration and the urban context of lifestyle migration. And I just want to very, very briefly draw a parallel between your interesting work on urban lifestyle migration, which also includes this element of entrepreneurship as well, and rural lifestyle migration. And here I go back to work that I did with Alan Williams and other colleagues in Italy, in Tuscany, back in the 1990s. What we have observed in Italy, and this is also relevant to work that I've done more recently with Eralba Cella at the University of Ancona, is that there's a kind of geographical frontier which develops once the initial lifestyle destination becomes too saturated or too expensive. And so what we see in Tuscany is that people, rather than go to Tuscany because it's become too expensive, they go to adjacent regions in Italy, to Umbria, to Marche, to Abruzzo, and so on. And I wonder whether one could foresee a similar process happening with Lisbon. I mean, obviously Lisbon is the hot place, maybe one of the hottest places in Europe to come for this kind of urban lifestyle migration, which appeals to various ages. But sooner or later, the market will become too expensive for certain tastes, and therefore I wonder where the frontier will extend, and you know, will it extend to Porto or to other, maybe to other Portuguese cities, or maybe it will jump to the Azores or somewhere else. So I'm just wondering about this idea of the moving frontier in this kind of migration.
Thanks, Russell, for this comment. I think it's already taking place, actually, because yes, Lisbon is getting saturated, and I think we can see that from the proliferation of co-living or co-working facilities opening in places like Ericeira, in Madeira. Madeira, they have a very unique case of the government collaborating to construct what they called a digital nomad village, where you have local stakeholders and housing and commercial facilities getting together to attract digital nomads, but also in Porto. And so I think it has already begun to spread it to other destinations in Portugal, where people tend to have lifestyle opportunities. So surf is very important, and sun, of course.
Okay, and now Professor Lucinda would like to intervene.
Yes, we have conducted field work in Bairro Interior, and for instance, we found there some people, some digital nomads that move, and they established there. I give you an example of a lady that came, a family that came from Britain, established there in Fundão, and she is an English teacher, and the students are in Hong Kong and Macau. So she works during the night. You know, it's just an example, but there are many, many more in remote areas, I would say, in the country. So that's our new project. We are working on a proposal to go, in fact, coordinated by Jennifer, and that's a new research line that we are trying to develop here at MIGRARE. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions and the comments. I think that we have to close now, although thank you for the extra little bit of time for questions. I think it was definitely worthwhile. So thank you to the audience for your participation and attention. So now we'll move to the next roundtable. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks for the resistance that stay with us. And I also thank the audience that is with us online. So we will continue with the roundtable to discuss and to reflect on the impacts of the pandemics on migration. And we have 4 panelists. I'm very happy to have here with us Professor Joaquim Arango, who is an emeritus professor of sociology at the Complutense University of Madrid, co-director of the Center for the Study of Migration and Citizenship, Instituto Universitário de Investigação Ortega y Gasset, Madrid. Well, he is a member of the editorial board of several important journals. He has published extensively, and he has collaborated as an expert with international institutions such as the European Commission, Council of Europe, OECD, ILO, and other. And he is a member of the External Advisory Committee of our PhD program on migration studies. Thank you for coming. I'm also very pleased to have here with us Dr. Sonia Pereira, who is a colleague and the High Commissioner for Migration of Portugal. She has a degree in economics and a PhD in geography from our university. And before she became the High Commissioner, she was responsible for coordinating the government's assistance project for refugee resettlement at the Lisbon office of the International Migration, International Organization for Migration. She works here as a researcher, and she still is an associate member of the MIGRARE research group. I must also mention that she has played a key role in 2 very important projects of our MIGRARE group that were mentioned by Jennifer, the TEMIS, Theorizing European Migration Systems, and Mobile Welfare, European Welfare Systems in Times of Mobility. And Professor Arango has been also a member of the advisory committee of the TEMIS project. We also have here Professor Ricard Morén-Alegret, who is Associate Professor of Geography at the University Autónoma de Barcelona and also Associate Researcher of the MIGRARE Research Group. He has coordinated several projects and field works in a variety of countries: Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, France, Greece, Ireland, Australia, and so on. He has published extensively, and he is working together with us in some projects. And finally, Amandine Desil, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at UMR Passage University of Bordeaux, and also an associate member of MIGRARE. And before that, she was a Marie Curie Individual Fellow at CEJ-IGOT, where she worked in the project that has already been mentioned by Jennifer. And well, she has recently co-edited an important volume, Visual Methodologies in Migration Studies, published by Springer. Okay, without further delays, I invite Professor Joaquim Arango to share with us his vision about the future or the main challenges of migration after the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. The title of this session is Migration in the Post-Pandemic Era. And I have the strange habit of taking titles literally. In this case, I am afraid that it will be far from easy. I am afraid that the end of the pandemic is not in sight. I don't know when the post-pandemic era will start, not to what extent will be it COVID-free and fully post-pandemic. and how many in which of the mobility restrictions it entails will stay put. In such a context, rather than devoting my time to speculate about the uncertainties of COVID-19, I will briefly discuss a few recent trends that are taking place in the planet of migration in this pandemic era. Unfortunately, these trends are anything but hopeful. A first hint at them comes from the addition to the lexicon of migration of terms such as pushbacks, geopolitical blackmail, hybrid threat, or the weaponization of migration that had clear military overtones. I am referring to a few factual changes that are often reported in the media and to their policy implications. The number of conflictive frontiers is multiplying, and very often they are leaving thousands of people stranded in desperate conditions, or people in a standoff between two countries. These recent conflicts, or these current conflicts, are becoming chronic, like the tensions with repeated use of pushbacks between Turkey and Greece, and of course with the equivalent in their Mexico-EU-US border. But even this classic, most iconic border in North America is registering impressive novelties. We know that Central Americans from the triangle of Central America have replaced Mexicans as the foremost component of these inflows, but they are not the ones that are registering the most impressive increases. Rather, Brazilians, Ecuadorians, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Cubans are arriving in large number, multiplying previous figures. And an increasing proportion of them is made up of family units, and many also there are unaccompanied minors, as it is also happening in the Mediterranean. Another telling novelty, hard to imagine just 1 year ago, is the politics of Belarus, offering visas and organized trips, especially to Kurds and Iraqis, and transporting them to the border with Poland and Lithuania in the hope of destabilizing the European Union. This is the most spectacular and clear case of migration weaponization, but not the only one. In 2020 and 2021, Turkey and Morocco have resorted to similar means by way of relaxing the contention of flows that they were previously carrying, flows towards Greece and towards the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, using migrants or would-be migrants as weapons for political purposes. By the way, these moves are making clear how dependent countries in the global north are in relation to their southern neighbors. Yet, not all the migration-related border tensions happen in south-north corridors. They are present also in north-north ones, as in the case of the maritime crossings between France and the English and the UK across the English Channel, with their serious political implications. Less known, but also tragic, unexpected, and telling is what is happening at the border between France and Spain. By the way, near the city where I grew up, in the Basque Country. Until this year, it was no border, we could say, in which not even the names of the countries, Spain and France, appeared there. Just they were replaced by regional names, and the border was just delineated by a peaceful, calm, and beautiful river. But along this year, the idyllic setting has been saddened by the repeated appearance of corpses of African migrants who have drowned trying to cross their way to France, desperately trying to cross the river. Contrary to what happens up north in the Channel, the relationship of France and Spain authorities remains friendly, but the hardening of borders and the rejection of secondary movements are creating havoc or distress where it didn't exist before. Let me see. 20 years ago, our colleague Jürgen Carling described our time as the era of involuntary immobility. Today, it seems that this immobility is increasingly unbearable for hundreds of thousands of people who live in countries where life is too tough. The number of desperate people who do not accept their immobility, even if rebelling against it entails heavy costs and risks, and their firm decision often clashes with increasingly fortified borders. In recent decades, migration, irregular migration has been the central concern of migration policy, and barriers and walls have proliferated. Someone told us recently that in 1990 in Europe there were about a dozen walls. Now there are over 70. But it's clear that walls are not a solution to these conflicts, as the example of North America has proven. I was saying that in recent decades, irregular migration was the central concern of migration policy. But I venture to say that it is being superseded in terms of attention and concern by border crossings, especially maritime crossings in the case of the European Union, much more than other forms of entry, such as overstaying, for instance. These crossings are becoming the overriding policy concern, probably on account of the impact they have on the media and their political utilization. In this way, these border tensions increasingly mix immigration and asylum, and they are overshadowing other parcels and areas of migration. There are reasons to think that the protection of borders, and I will speed up, is getting the highest policy priority in our days. In turn, externalizing border controls is increasingly appearing as the preferred policy strategy. Materialized in the EU agreements with Turkey and Libya, and in the less controversial and more discreet of Spain and Morocco, externalization seems to be effective in the Mediterranean if reducing inflows is the main policy goal. It has been imposed as well in the US-Mexican border as far as the Central American caravans are concerned. This policy strategy increasingly includes the intention to externalizing asylum processing as well. The Trump administration has gone quite far in that direction with the Remain in Mexico program that requires asylum seekers to remain abroad while their claims are being processed. Last week, the US judiciary ordered it to be maintained, frustrating the Biden intention to suppress it. By the way, the heavy legacy of the Trump era is proving resilient and resistant to efforts at change. Some European governments would like to follow this example and are taking steps in that direction to externalize asylum processing. A nasty version of this strategy has been practiced for years by Australia, confining migrants intercepted at sea in camps in Nauru and New Guinea. As said before, externalization is showing effectiveness in border control, but it is paying a heavy price for it, a price in legal, moral, and political terms. And these costs are being disregarded. It is a clear case of effectiveness versus principles. A serious consequence of the systematic vulneration of both international and European asylum is taking place with disrespect of the principle of non-refoulement and degradation of asylum standards, which are already having impacts over Schengen. As a EU footnote, this stance is affecting the prestige and credit of Frontex, whose powers, means, and resources are increasing. But criticism is mounting with accusations of violations of international law and disguised implications in acts of refoulement and pushbacks, violent behavior towards migrants, and lack of transparency and accountability. All this is happening in a turbulent context in which some governments are hardening their policies, a context presided over by an acute process of politicization and securitization of migration, resulting from a negative representation of immigration and asylum, fostered by radical right parties who make the rejection of migration as their main flag. Let's hope that the end of the pandemic era will be replaced by a more hopeful one in these matters. Thank you, and sorry about.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Sonia Pereira. I know she is in a hurry to go to the airport. So immediately, okay.
Maybe you need to.
You can speak.
Okay, you don't need to turn off that. Can I take off my mask? Thank you for the invitation and for the kind words. Bom dia a todos, obrigada pela oportunidade de estar aqui também a partilhar convosco esta perspectiva de onde me encontro hoje, que tem a ver com o trabalho que é desenvolvido no Alto Comissariado para as Migrações. And now I'll switch to English and I'll continue my presentation. It's really based on a reflection, and I will be very brief, and I apologize already for this because I have to leave. That is intended to highlight some of the key points that from our experience over the last year and a half have emerged from the pandemic and its effects. We are still within the pandemic. We thought maybe a few weeks ago that we would not come to this again, but we are still here. And I would like to reflect on this, also taking into account the position of migrants in this context and the role of public policies and public services in this process. First, what we have observed and witnessed was a very fast, accelerated digital transition, and this has affected the way we work, including both the adoption of telework regimes, but also the increasing importance of technology and jobs with high technology components that require adjusted skills. We also provide and access public services, and this is something that I in particular would like to highlight, which are becoming also increasingly digital and also require digital competencies, both from the service providers and also the service users. It has also impacted the way we study and learn. And there was a strong impact in schools and in the school system with the increased use of technology-based methods that require not only skills, but also equipment and internet access. All of these have and will continue to have impact in our societies, migrants included. And while we all recognize that there are numerous advantages to be highlighted, easier long distance access to information and services without the need to move from one place to another, better conciliation of work and other tasks like going to a public service and family life, and also quicker access to services, to public services in particular, and some administrative procedures as well. And this has very much also impacted the services that are provided to migrants by the High Commission for Migration, ACM. For example, the services that we provide online have been reinforced through the migrant support line, as well as online, with more response being given by email. And for example, the specific emails for the national support centers that we have in the country, we have now 4, but initially we had 3, were only created because of the pandemic. Because before, this was considered the secondary channel. Most of the services that we provided were face-to-face in presence in our centers, and only after the pandemic we started giving more importance to the kind of support that we can actually provide online without the need to come to our centers. We are also providing more training online to different entities that are spread throughout the country, and disseminating more information also through social media and our website. Language learning has also been carried out online by the entities that provide these courses, and access has been improved. We know that there have been very good experiences also in other countries of improved access due to increased online presence and service provision, including when what refers to administrative procedures also for migrants, including asylum seekers. However, there are also important risks for the most vulnerable groups that may have limited digital competencies, access to equipment or internet connections, and this increases the risk of being further excluded from service provision, labor market, and also lagging behind in school. This affects migrants as well, and for this reason in our outreach activities we need to be sensitive to the needs of migrants and maintain a strong connection with the ground. This has proved to be very much necessary during the activities that we carried out during the pandemic. On the one side, we were reinforcing our digital response. On the other side, we had to be on the street and talking to people face to face, and this was very important. We need to simultaneously be providing training in digital skills. This is fundamental. This is necessary for labor market incorporation and for better integration into high skilled jobs or higher skilled jobs, and also for increasingly to access also services and the exercise of citizenship that is going to be very much digital and increasingly so. Secondly, and also connected to the above, migrants face a higher risk of being excluded from the labor market and are also at a higher risk of poverty during economic downturn and also in face of more precarious work. And therefore, promoting training that facilitates the incorporation or reincorporation in the labor market are important as well, as the adoption of better mechanisms that facilitate the recognition of skills and previous professional trajectories in parallel also with promoting language skills acquisition. We still face many difficulties regarding the access of migrants to processes of skills recognition when they do not necessarily have the diplomas or the documents that prove their level of schooling. And this has been an obstacle also to access, for example, professional training, since the registration in these courses in our country is still very much dependent on the recognized level of school that people have with them. And this is an area where we are still lacking more innovative and effective responses. And it is crucial as an area that can promote adequate employment and contribution to the process of economic recovery. Thirdly, and in the field of education, remote learning is more difficult for migrant children who are less likely to have access to computer and an internet connection. Data from the OECD, for example, indicates that 8.1% of those born outside of the EU report not being able to afford a computer, compared to only 3.1% of native born. Different countries have highlighted the negative impact of the pandemic also on migrant women who have been affected disproportionately in their work and family lives. Stronger support for migrant children and families is also crucial to avoid lagging behind in learning and adding further strains on migrants' family lives. In Portugal, the Choices program, promoted and funded by ACM, created in 2001 to foster the social inclusion of children and young people from more vulnerable socioeconomic backgrounds, particularly migrant descendants and Roma children, but also others, has been an important response to complement school activities, and has also very strongly contributed to facilitate the connections between children and their families and the schools, even during the pandemic. And many maintain some form of activity and provided important support as classes transition to online models. Also, the municipal intercultural mediators have provided important support to improve the relationship of families and migrant children with schools. These school mediations' main objective is to strengthen access to education and educational attainment, pursuing studies, and include a series of activities that contribute to this end. Promoting actions of intercultural education, to demystify prejudices among the whole educational community is also an important role of this mediation. And these actions are increasingly more important as migrant children may face greater disadvantage due to the negative effects of the pandemic. It should be noted also that during the pandemic lockdown, the municipal intercultural mediators provided school support to children and families without access to computers, and liaise between the schools and families in the delivery of study working sheets and computers, and this was very important. Finally, and I'm sorry for rushing, I would like to emphasize the importance of partnerships. In Portugal, we implement in the field of migration and integration a whole of government and whole of society approach in the spirit also of the Global Compact for Migration, and this has proved to be a very effective way of working in this field. Understanding and dealing with the effects of COVID-19 in our communities, and specifically its impacts on migrants, has involved and will continue to involve a multidimensional and multi-actors approach. The role of local actors, specifically municipalities, has been crucial, as well as civil society organizations, including migrant associations. Particularly since we are witnessing an increasing dispersion of migrants in the national territory away from the large urban centers where they used to concentrate and where central services are presented, towards more rural areas, more distance, and also more dispersed, and with less access to public services. The issues migrants face in urban areas may also bear some differences with the issues that migrants face in rural areas, and we've seen a little bit of that discussion here today. And in these rural areas where migrants are mostly concentrated in the agriculture sector, with all the issues that have been brought up before. Providing access to information in different languages and about the different dimensions of migrants' lives, as well as to services, needs to be guaranteed also at the local level. At ACM, we have increased the number of partnerships with municipalities and civil society organizations for establishing more CLIMEs, the local centers to support migrant integration throughout the country. There are now 138 of them in Portugal, also including the islands, and we continue to support migrants associations and other civil society organizations to implement activities at the local level for the promotion of migrant integration, and also taking into account the effects of COVID and the need for increased social protection and healthcare. And now to conclude, and beyond the immediate measures that are also necessary in face of the pandemic, we are also looking at more mid to long-term developments that will be needed to sustain a successful recovery and beyond, to continue the process of building inclusive societies with the full contributions of migrants, energy and aspirations. And thank you, and sorry for having to leave soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And now I invite Professor. Yes, maybe you can come here. Maybe you can change. Sorry. No, you can. It's no. Robert. Miguel não está cá. Isto, sim, é que... Ah, está aqui. Okay. Não, é para partilhar. Ah, agora já está. Já está.
Bom dia, muito obrigado pela invitação. Many thanks for the invitation for being here. I will just present a few notes from a preliminary study in a few minutes. Just a quick presentation offering a few ideas, talking a bit about this pandemic and maybe in the near future post-pandemic situation, hopefully. As we know, the pandemic is not evenly distributed worldwide. There's an uneven distribution of cases, experiences, perceptions, deaths, records, because not everybody is recording in the same way sometimes, and policies. At the same time, immigration is not evenly distributed either, but it's still very relevant in spite of the immobilities that the pandemic forced us. I will focus on the Mediterranean scene. 20 years ago, Russell King was very kind to invite me together with other young people then to participate in this book titled The Mediterranean Passage with other colleagues here maybe. And I've been focusing on the Mediterranean because in a recent project, we were doing a field work on a Mediterranean touristic area where there's a lot of immigration, and this was also part of a trans-Mediterranean relations project. So, but I just will present a few slides here dealing with some interviews I did in January, February, and March this year. During the last years, I've been also interested in connecting migration studies and arts, and particularly the work of William Shakespeare. And I found this quote from Shakespeare in Times, in the last play he apparently wrote, entitled The Tempest, where there's also this idea of the Mediterranean as a meeting place. As I said, this fieldwork was in a touristic and area in Costa Brava in Girona province, Spain. And it's an area where there's also a lot of relative terms, a high number of immigration from various origins, both in Europe and from other continents, both lifestyle immigrants, labor immigrants, a wide variety of immigration flows. There's this combination of tourism and immigration, and I was wondering when Lucinda kindly invited me to join to this panel, if we could be just commenting a few ideas on how this pandemic is affecting immigrant organizations in this touristic area, where the economy is mainly based on tourism, coastal tourism, but also rural tourism in the inland villages. So I just will focus here on a few interview quotes that, for instance, on different impacts that can be negative or not of this pandemic. On the one hand, there was this idea raised by this interviewee on how there was obviously a negative impact on the local economy, but at the same time that was also an opportunity to set up new community developments. And then there was also the idea of how they could overcome that challenge, how to recover. So there was the idea of loss and recovery from that negative impact. At the same time, there was this overdependence on tourism that was raised and highlighted during the interview. In contrast to that, we found the positive impact of the pandemic as some new gains came in this touristic area, and some new tourists arrived from other European countries. There was this connection between, as I said, this is a part of a project focusing on cross-Mediterranean relations. So most of the interviews here are from Northern Africa and the Middle East. And this interviewee, for instance, was highlighting how the border closure, when the border between Spain and Morocco was closed due to the pandemic, and now it's closed again. I mean, there are repatriations of Spanish people in Morocco, etc. How that affected tourism, and how that's also seen as an opportunity for in a place where there's an important number of North African immigrants, how that is also allowing to new second homeowners from Northern Europe, or France, or Holland or Belgium, who have this Moroccan background, or from other North African countries, are buying second homes in Costa Brava, in Empordà area, and how there's this new connections between this, for instance, Moroccan community, or that was set up in Spain with other communities that used to go on holidays in the summer to northern Morocco or to other parts of North Africa, but due to the pandemic, they are now having holidays or even buying second homes in Spain in the route to North Africa, because the highways from Europe to North Africa crosses that area. And then there's also the idea of the neutral pandemic impact. So how some associations are changing with the change, how they may in the past these associations were, immigrant associations were focusing on leisure activities, cultural activities, and with the pandemic, they have been changing, adapting their activities to more social and healthcare type of activity, adapting also to more to online activities, when in the past maybe everything was on site, was physical, and there were no virtual activities at all. Online was just secondary, or even less than that. And so that's how this so-called adaptation. And then another type of possible impact of what's going on over there is the idea of how this monopoly of so-called monopoly, touristic monopoly in this region, but in other regions in the Mediterranean, maybe under threat. I mean, it was a kind of call of alarm. There was a kind of, in some parts of the Mediterranean, due to this overdependence on tourism, and how there's this difficulty of overcoming even in a region like Catalonia, where we have a more or less diversified economy. There are some municipalities where there's such a big overdependence on tourism, and in some on mass tourism in particular. So this is a bit of a summary, and I just wanted to share another question that would be, how can tourism and migration policies be coordinated, but also how to coordinate at various administrative levels in Europe, but beyond Europe, in line with what Joaquin was saying before me. How can coordination be improved, learning from the experience of this pandemic that may become not just a unique experience, but the beginning of something else. So thank you, and yeah. So,
thank you very much. I invite Zêzere. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this morning and for the invitation to reflect on, well, in my case, I was invited to reflect on ICT, digital research, migration in post-COVID times. So it's really too bad that Sonia is gone, because they were, it's kind of an academic take of what she's exposed on ICT and digital translation right before. So first of all, what do I mean? What do we mean, researchers, by ICT? I wanted to clarify, and maybe clarifying is going to be kind of an abuse, because when we'll hear what's in the bucket list, So ICT and migration, we've been talking about internet-based resources, including online information related to migration and to arrival, to settlement, either institutional, like the ones that Sonia was presenting about the ACM, but also on social media, online bureaucracy, apps that support various dimensions of migration and settlement, including a digital platform for the gig economy, so Uber, Glovo, among others. We're also talking about messages and still or moving images that we record and then share through instant messaging and social media, and internet-based video and audio calls. Yeah. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to speak of I'm just going to share a few reflections on first ICT mediated migration. Then I'll shift to ICT mediated research in the field of international migration, and I'll close this little reflection on the role of us intellectuals in such a context, the context that Sonia has presented. So ICT mediated migration is by no means a new topic of research. However, it's clear that the sanitary crisis, the lockdowns imposed by government and the different restrictions have intensified and accelerated ICT practices in the field of for the ones that are experiencing migration and for the service providers. So I'm an immigrant, albeit a pretty privileged one. But as an immigrant, I live far away from my family and from my friends. And so what has happened to me during this sanitary crisis is that to compensate for the absence of visits, we've been intensifying video calls. So we have a weekly family call that still happened almost 2 years after. Our family group has been as lively than ever. I've also intensified calls to elderly members of the family to compensate for their loneliness because they've been extremely isolated during the crisis. We've also started to put together those monthly video sequences of children growing to share with grandparents and uncles and aunts, and all these have triggered new negotiations, new rules about what it is to live online as a family. For instance, we've had to negotiate what kind of pictures would be shared beyond the family circle, what kind of pictures would be taken, etc. And those negotiations are new to us, and they're clearly linked to the intense online exchanges that started to take place. And they're also things that we should think about when we start looking into the intense online lives that have been unfolding during the pandemic. As a migrant, again, in an unfamiliar place here in Portugal, I have also used a lot of online resources, Facebook groups to grab a sense of bureaucracy in Portugal, while face-to-face support in local administrations came to a halt. Facebook groups that were also useful to understand the new measures and restrictions that were changing regularly, and I've used other websites for immigrants, in general, to gather information. And well, again, this is not new. There's been there's been research done on how ICT facilitate migrants' lives before, from preparing departure, preparing return, making the route easier, connecting with others, keeping in touch with family and friends, preventing dangers, signaling presence when distress, navigating the administration, of course, and then finding a home, a job. So many more tasks that today we can rely on online information and online support to tackle. But it was clearly reinforced during COVID. And that's how several seminal works that date before COVID, such as Diminiscu's The Connected Migrant and Epistemological and Manifesto, that you may have reheard about the last months, or Loretta Baldazza's work on co-presence. All those works are re-emerging in our reading lists for us to understand how we can work on co-presence, like on ICT mediated co-presence, how we can look differently at what's going on when face-to-face relations are made more difficult and we start connecting with each other online. And I was looking into like bibliography that I have stored on my computer, and I found this Danish Refugee Council research called Getting to Europe the WhatsApp Way. And I thought that was getting closer to us than ever. So in many of the researches that I've been done, there is always a line saying that ICT mediating migration and ordinary co-presence are a source of empowerment, a way to keep ties and networks going. So we are together even when we are far, even when borders are closed, when travels is impeded, you can keep on together. But what's also emerging in the meetings, webinars, and forums dealing with this intensification of ICT mediated co-presence is like, who can afford to be online, to live online, and to share a life with others online? So what are the digital affordances? What is digital literacy? And what kind of divide line are we creating, like online, apart from the divide line that already exists in our physical life? And so addressing these inequalities and proposing alternatives is like a new task for us researchers, together, of course, with other actors in the ground. So inequalities, I think Sonia has already talked about. It's not about being competent in understanding the technology, but also having an internet connection, a service available. There's always a language divide. So the ACM that she represents has put a lot of information online, but in which language can I read those information? Access to education and age will affect digital literacy. What kind of information is available? Too much info can kill the info, but also sometimes it's not updated at all. There can be also a lack of awareness on the part of service providers. I was also thinking about the documentation that you need to register for online services. And in Portugal, you need what they call a chave digital for everything. If you're a migrant, you don't have that. So like all the efforts of the administration to actually make public services available online are not working if you don't have this key, this number that enables you to access governmental services. And this is without speaking about discrimination online, hate speech, etc. So before I elaborate on how we, the intellectuals, could support solutions to reduce those inequalities, let's move on to the second point very quickly on like ICT mediated research in the field of international migration. And that is also a new part of our professional lives. And once again, when it is crossed by inequalities. So how many of us can actually work from home, have the equipment, the internet speed, the space, the quiet, or even the economic means to, I don't know, I'm thinking now, to warm our workspace at home? How many of us are literate enough to teach, organize discussions, push forwards projects only online? Those have been also real questions during the last 2 years. And now I'm in the middle of a research on immigration policy in Abertura, which is a few kilometers from where we sit now. And several interviews were connecting online because either it was not possible to meet in an office because they've closed, or people were afraid to meet in person. So they've asked me, like, can we do interviews online? And so we also have to work on the bias that implies, like, people behave differently online than when we are face to face. The mediation of the camera, of the microphone, of the screen is something that we have to take into account when we analyze our data. And while I find it extremely convenient to record the conversation that are always in like fast-paced Portuguese, and then I can listen to them, transcribe them, it means that I have a video file on my computer with the interview, and usually it's on my personal computer because I'm working from home most of the time the last 2 years. That also raised a lot of ethical questions. And so that brings me to my third point. What is the role of the intellectual in the face of this new digital transition? So of course, finding solutions to reduce inequalities when it comes to the use of ICT by migrants. And so far, there are things that have been talked about like secondhand devices, intermediaries, participatory research, participatory approach, sorry, like pushing institutions to update regularly their information, clear messages, foresee regulation and safe use of information, online information and other data that we upload when we use online services, but also design with the users, or at least with them in mind. And here again, it's not very far away from what we're doing offline, right? Like there is this persistent issue that when we study policy, immigration policy, we study policy that is made without the migrants. So the same applies here with digital access to information for migrants. This is all done without the migrants and without, or only with high-skilled privileged migrants such as myself in mind. And so like one of the care that we have to have is that isolation online doesn't go hand in hand with segregation offline. The second thing is a little bit more long-term, and it's to critically reflect on this search. And I've noted here, I'm going to take just a few more minutes. I have to, okay, so I just wanted to question, a last question for us to think about is how we can question autonomy. So there is this idea that a device can open the world for you and enable autonomy, but in the face of digitally enabled transnational repression, pressure of the family online to send remittances, to act in several ways, the gig economy, the use of big data, could we actually spend some time and question the so-called autonomy that digital access and ICT might offer to migrants?
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, I've not been informed until we started the session that we must leave because there is an exam here. I really apologize for that because I was not aware. So I would like to thank to the speakers. It's a pity we don't have the time for discuss such rich and complementary interventions. But anyway, thank you very much for the participants and for those of you who are online. And fortunately, we'll have the opportunity to continue maybe this discussion in our meetings within the context of the PhD program on migration studies, because we will continue this afternoon and also Thursday. I don't know if Ricardo or José Manuel want to say something to close as the main organizers or not. If not, we stop here. And once again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.